According to the CDC today, only 16.7% of Americans have an updated COVID-19 booster. However, 81.3% apparently perceiving that they had been following the science had volunteered for at least one shot, indicating almost a 65% decrease in exuberance for following what many have described as science, and even, as some called, common sense. Responding to market forces of supply and demand, as rational actors, it would not be unreasonable to find, as has occurred, the leading pharmaceutical providers of these amazing elixirs have increased the prices fourfold in market correction at both Pfizer and Moderna. But what explains the course correction for those consumers for this medical product who claim to have been following the science? What is their rational reason for refraining from doing what they had felt so urgently in need to do before? What made them suddenly stop following what they had described in the past as science? Only 42% of Americans hold at least a bachelor's degree, often identified as a credential associated with intelligence, while for 28.1% of Americans, completion of high school is their highest educational attainment. And at least according to the Pew Research Center, by April 2020, while as many as 3 in 10 Americans had believed that the origins of a novel coronavirus had been connected to human activity in a research laboratory, some 48% of those Americans had not even gone to college, which tended to bolster the idea amongst the American populace in at least a coincidental correlation, and especially the American electorate during a presidential election year, that you were not educated if you had believed anything other than a theory of natural spillover arising from what had been described as a zoonotic evolution or zoonosis event. However, with such a great emphasis on communal responsibility and doing the right thing, moral arguments, even if not religious, even finding the president describing getting the shot as an exercise of duty, like going to vote. From a moral perspective, and even legal perspective, there quite often arises a duty described in the courts as the conduct of due diligence. And at least in college, where only 6% of those who graduate have even majored in biology, and from whom only 2% of that number go on to graduate study, the question of duty that most often arises before sitting for a college exam, especially in science, is whether or not the student had studied for the exam and completed the homework. And with 3 years being far more than ample time to consider the complexities of a pandemic virus, one would purport to support a theory of natural spillover might, at least in the courts, find a necessity for a showing of evidence in support of that conclusion, as any rational man would be capable of doing. In communal responsibility, looking out for your fellow man, as was so often heard, did you take the time to do the homework to provide the best assistance to others and for yourself? And at least in logic and debate, simply calling your opponent stupid or even crazy is not a cogent argument, but rather an ad hominem attack that would be described as a logical fallacy. Not going to the proof of the matter, as those who majored in philosophy or even conducted a study in law are most certainly aware. So, for those who at least claimed to have followed the science, even as now popularly elected members of Congress engage in directed inquiry to determine the origins of a novel coronavirus, for at least according to official figures has been attributed to what is now approaching over 7 million fatalities worldwide. exceeding even the total number of deaths during the Holocaust in half the time, let us consider the science that you claim that you had considered while telling others that you were following the science. Beginning first with viruses, about which many may first become familiar while still in grammar school, elementary school, as the most abundant biological particles in the world, like looking up at space at the stars, providing them the most optimal chances in mere probability to present an existential threat to mankind. However, as of 2012, according to Mark Woolhouse, a professor of infectious disease at the University of Edinburgh, who had considered the problem, there were only 219 viruses known to be present to be even the slightest threat to mankind, which, by the law of large numbers, with which at least some may become familiar while studying probability and statistics in high school, would make the probability of a new emerging virus extremely rare. And following the science, as you had professed to have done for 3 years, certainly this empirical fact had weighed into your most thoughtful considerations while following the science, as you say, in your quest to prevent an unacceptable loss of human life, which now exceeds 1 million amongst your fellow Americans. And what of coronaviruses, the most abundant of families and the largest in genome size of all of the viruses, lending to that biological particle the most optimal advantage in presenting a threat to mankind, and first discovered amongst animals in the 1930s, as surely you know from your research, for which there are only over 3,000 that infect exclusively birds, and over 3,000 of which that infect exclusively mammals, but found only one coronavirus, a marginal part of the common cold, first discovered in the 1960s, present any threat at all to mankind and more akin to a chicken coronavirus. Well, certainly, if you had been following the science, as you claim, even taking a look at the official CDC website, a primary source for easy reference upon which at least those who have gone to college and continued on to graduate study might rely, there had been only a total of 6 human coronaviruses harmful to mankind before the present one, making this novel coronavirus only the 7th to present a threat to mankind. And surely, in communal responsibility and following the science, as you say, this had been considered in your rational calculations before concluding that this novel coronavirus had not found its origins in a laboratory. Would it in any way alter that conclusion if you had become aware that, according to Nicola Petrosillo, the editor-in-chief for Infectious Disease Reports, of what only today make 7 human coronaviruses in total, before the novel coronavirus, 4 additional human COVs had successfully been identified. Severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, SARS-CoV, in 2002, NL63 in late 2004, HKU1 in January 2005, and Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus, MERS-CoV, in 2012, making it a quite remarkable occurrence for this virus threat amongst coronaviruses to mankind to suddenly become so very active, and indicative of some change having occurred to explain this sudden and abrupt departure from what had been the normal, and yet finding very little scientific theories advanced to explain these new collisions with novel viruses, particularly those with an etiology of a quite singular kind, as this one has been described. And most certainly, following the science, you too had considered this while you had endorsed a natural evolutionary theory and spillover for the cause of the disruption that all have experienced during these 3 years of a pandemic, in which everyone lost something, according to the president, even if it may have been different. Yet and still, at least amongst evolutionary biologists and other notables within the scientific community, it has been suggested that strong evidence now supports a theory that raccoon dogs, which hibernate in winter, who had happened to be present at the wet market in Wuhan by at least coincidental correlation, had been responsible for not just one, but two emerging lineages that had suddenly emerged and coincided as early as November 2019, only in Wuhan, a city of over 11 million, and only at one of three possible wet markets, one measuring the size of 9 American football fields and connected to only 27 cases of infection, giving rise to a pandemic for which churches, businesses, and schools were closed. Masking guidance and social distancing measures were implemented, and apparently amazingly safe and effective vaccines, for which over 80% of Americans have volunteered to take at least one dose, albeit described only as COVID-19 countermeasures in the Emergency Use Authorization Declaration in March 2020 that had prompted their development, without any knowledge of either the infectious dose nor correlate of protection, which had in science previously, before evolving science, been prerequisites for developing effective vaccines without the necessity of large sample size phase 3 clinical trials. And you accept this as true because on faith and belief, as an intelligent person, you followed the science. We must therefore presume. Tell the truth. Tell the truth. Tell the truth. I believe it's one of the most ghostly manifestations that I've ever seen. Whether it's real or simply conjecture, one of those things that people seeking to find some mystery to fool themselves into believing, but with some other perfectly rational cause and explanation, is a question that only you can answer with your capacity for reason, which often involves research and study, not simply guessing. Impossible. So with Xeroxing and holography, just like a few short years ago, this was almost impossible. In fact, there were videotape replays, like the ones you're watching right now. People have been proclaiming the marvels of science for thousands of years. And maybe one day, we will finally discover the origins of this novel coronavirus. What a tremendous gain that would be for actual science, and what a tragic loss for storytelling. This message was approved by Major Mike Webb.